So, I'd like to thank you for joining us today for the Life Stories Conversations. I wanted to start by asking you to talk a little bit about your research here, introduce yourself, your role at UVic, various things like that.
Yeah, my name is Ulrich Mueller. I'm a professor in lifespan development and I'm also department chair at the moment. We're here in the Child Development Lab where we do research with children, and we're sitting on these small chairs to see the world through the child's eyes. And the age groups are starting from infancy basically to nowadays middle schoolers, adolescents, and my primary group of participants are preschool children. We examine children, we look at their interactions with their parents, and we also give them a number of different assessments. We design tasks that are playful in nature, and mostly they have a lot of fun, and sometimes they even they are very eager to come back.
Yeah. I can see it looks like a wonderful place.
Yeah, it's difficult. The difficulty is to get them away from the play space and to the testing rooms.
Exactly.
But yeah, it's generally it's a lot of fun. I like the age group of preschoolers because first of all they can talk. If they're not their own, it's good to listen. Otherwise, they talk your ear off. But it's a fascinating period because they're not in school yet. They're not as they just sometimes have very strange ideas, and it is really fun to talk to them and to listen to them and to see what's the foundation of their weird ideas that they have and that seem to so silly to us and so nonsensical, but they have a reason for it. They just think so differently, qualitatively differently than we as adults, and I find that fascinating, and that is for that reason I like to really assess preschool children. And they're also a bit wild still, and not as measured. There are not as many social norms that constrains them, and makes it fascinating to interact with them and assess them.
So what brought you to the study of childhood?
This is a complex story, actually. I did work with children who were physically disabled and had often mental psychological disorders. Nowadays they would be diagnosed as children with autism often, but also children with Down syndrome, adults who had severe accidents, and some of them suffered from multiple sclerosis, therefore physical but also mental issues. And I did this as a conscientious objector, because in Germany you have to do army service, or if not, then you could be a conscientious objector, and did an alternative.
And
I did the alternative then it was a church organization where I had to organize holidays and leisure time activities, go swimming with children and with adults. And they were mixed, ideally they were mixed groups. And for example, we went to Paris once with something like 10 wheelchairs. And I remember that the wheelchairs to go through the metro or go up the stairs of the Louvre, it was, the Louvre it was not handicap accessible. Yeah, it was really difficult. For that reason, we mostly went to Holland at that time, because Holland was in the 80s already very wheelchair friendly. All the sidewalks are not. I mean, partly because of the bicycles there.
Yeah.
But what I noticed during my work with those, particularly with the children, is that they differed remarkably in terms of the abilities that they had. Same child with Down syndrome sometimes could live independently, and another child with Down syndrome could not live independently. Therefore, there were marked differences in the life skills that they had, sometimes in the intellectual skills that they had. And that seemed to me partly due to the early assessment of these children. Therefore, children with autism, or children at that point they were called children with minimal brain dysfunction, but they had also enormous differences, and how early it was diagnosed that something was not okay, and then how early intervention started. Therefore, I was very interested then in diagnostics, and I wanted to become a clinical psychologist, a clinical child psychologist. And that's how I started in psychology. In psychology in Germany at that point, you could not just pick a university. There was a very elaborate system. It's called numerus clausus. Only if you had a certain grade point average you were allowed, and then you were assigned to the place, basically, that you had to go to. Could express a preference, but you didn't necessarily get the place you wanted to go. Now, the place I wanted to go to was a place that was famous for its work on early child assessment intervention, and I couldn't get in there. Therefore, I got my second choice. That was not as good, but I encountered there a child development psychologist who taught classes on language development. And his classes were such that he came in and he never had a prepared lecture. It was all we sat around and we just had a conversation. And I thought, man, this is so fascinating, just the way that he talked. And the learning experience was, I can't even remember one fact from his classes, but they were just so inspiring, and it was that his enthusiasm for what he was doing was just very stimulating. And I remember we did have a class on dreams where we had to do dream diaries. We had a class on Norbert Elias, the sociologist, and we had classes that were not just psychology classes. They combine everything from philosophy, sociology, psychoanalysis, which is usually shunned in psychology. And he was so broad in terms of his knowledge background. It was a fascinating person, but he was also very strong on the view that children construct their reality, and we all construct our reality, and that children are agents and not just some kind of passive sponges that soak stuff up, but they construct meaning out of things. And that resonated with me, and that was really a key message that came across all his seminars and classes that I took with him, and that I took really serious into heart, and I was influenced by it. My background is a constructivist background, therefore I think we all construct our realities, and that starts already in infancy. And that for me also implies that little children then, even as the youngest infants, it's not they make meaning out of things that are there, but the meaning-making process changes depending on the knowledge that they have already acquired. Therefore, there is a qualitative difference between how children make meaning and how adults make meaning, and that the meaning-making process then becomes more and more similar to adult meaning-making process. That's a very prolonged process. I mean, and differs across cultures. The context plays an enormous role, but it's an active process of meaning-making. It's not just that there's some information, you soak it up, you're like a computer processing stuff. It's not just that the brain is doing some work, but it's a psychological process of meaning-making. And that is something that stayed with me. And meaning-making for me is such that it is a constructive process, because otherwise we would all have the same reality if it would just be a copying process. But it's a constructive process in the sense that our history and our life history, our biography factors into this meaning-making process. And that's why we disagree, that's why we come to different evaluations sometimes of the same kind of information. It's a constructive process. And that was fascinating for me. And somehow I then also, he studied language development, Professor Werner Deutsch, and I loved language development, and I thought that the constructivist philosophy was very inspiring, and I then was drawn into child development and did still my clinical degree, but I noticed that I found research very interesting, his research in particular, and did then my German degree, a diploma under him, and wanted to continue, but at that point nothing was possible in terms of academic positions in Germany. In the early 90s there was just the reunification, and money was spent on other things, and it was difficult to find jobs. And as a clinical psychologist I was completely unsuited, at least as adult clinical psychologist. I did try make some ways into therapy, but my supervisor said I shouldn't try. It would not be healthy for me or the clients, and discouraged me from pursuing it any further. I did not like it that much. I liked more children, and it was more fascinating simply. And as a result, then I stayed for a couple of months in the United States with a person my German professor arranged the contact there, and I liked it because it was very research intensive, and I then started a graduate program in the United States in Philadelphia, and that's essentially how I got then more and more into lifespan development. It's also sometimes a weird thing that what kind of coincidences happen. Like one person, like a professor, who influences you so much, and it's not just by teaching you particular facts, but just the way in which the person interacts with you and what kind of and it was eye-opening in a way, the way in which he interacted. And it was more like a Socratic method. It was never actually any lecture. I don't know, I have never tried this in my own classes. Perhaps I'm not confident enough, or probably it's a level of confidence, but he just came in and then he asked a couple of questions and that started a dialogue. And it was in a way very unstructured, but on the other hand, I think I learned more, and so I think did others, than through a lecture, because it was a exploration of a topic among kind of equals. He had an advantage, he knew a little bit more, but that was a really fascinating way of learning, and resonated with me, and that's how I ended up in this area. After getting my PhD, I was tagged along with my wife. She got a job in Boston, and I started then at the Center for Adoption Research and Foster Care, which is, I was completely unqualified to do this. I had no background, but it was a new center. They needed a research coordinator, and I started as a research coordinator. That was a really good experience in some ways, because it was very applied research. I had to interact with the Department of Social Services, had to write briefs, these executive summaries that had to be understandable for lay people on, say, healthcare in foster care, in healthcare of foster kids, or things like kinship care, which is a big topic in the United States, or attachment disorders in children who were adopted after having suffered from trauma. And my background provided me with that knowledge, but not with the ability to write in a halfway understandable manner to lay people. And I think I learned something there, which was a great experience. I also did some research on children who were adopted, but later in adulthood searched for their birth parents. Therefore, you can then ask to open your birth records. I mean, there are different types of adoption. Like open adoption, you stay in contact with your biological parents, but in other types of adoption, then the birth records are sealed, and you can ask in some states to open them, and then you can find out where your biological parents live, and what does then meeting your biological parent do to your well-being. What kind of relationship do you establish? What effect does it have on your relationship to your adoptive parents? And the complexity of these relationships, I found fascinating. And there was also some really interesting sociological issues around this, like the idea, I mean, you see opera, I don't know, opera might be, I watched opera a couple of times, not that many times, but I like to actually. But the point is, sometimes she had these reunions between their biological parents and adoptees in her show. And it was then described always in these metaphors of love at first sight, and these, as if blood, there's something mystical about blood relationships, and then that leads to adoptive parent relationships between adoptees and their adoptive parents to be considered not as strong because they're missing something. And it's an interesting sociological, societal, well, could even say stigma around being adopted, and that I found quite interesting. And then I mean, I know that the literature says the kids who are adopted at infants and have not suffered trauma and so on, they do, in terms of their mental health, no difference than kids who stay with their biological parents. But at around the age of 10 or 12, it starts that they have more problems with aggression and depression and so on. And I think then they understand what it means to be adopted, and there is some kind of stigma related to it. And instead of biologizing it, like some people do, oh, these kids, there's something in the genes from their biological parents and so on. I think there's a psychological factor that is related to it as well. But yeah, I dealt during my time 2 years then as a research coordinator.
Great learning experience.
Was a great learning experience,
Really?
completely different area of research,
Yeah.
but it teaches you versatility to step out of what you feel comfortable with and learn some skills that might be useful. During my time as a research coordinator, I attended a conference and I heard a really fascinating speech by a very young professor from the University of Toronto. And it was an area of research, again, I had not a lot of background in, but I thought he was just fantastic and inspiring. And after his talk, I went to him and said, "Oh, I really liked your research. Can you send me a couple of articles?" And he said, "Why don't you apply it to the postdoc position that is open?" I applied, and I then was a postdoc at the University of Toronto.
University of Toronto. Oh, nice.
For 20 months until 2001. And he was an up and rising star, and I did so much research with him that afterwards I had a lot of offers. I went to job talks and I got a lot of offers
Nice.
from a variety of different universities that I could choose from, and I picked Penn State, partly because of the reputation and partly because I knew a couple of professors there. Was not a good choice in retrospect. I shouldn't have gone to the United States. Iraq war started soon.
Oh, yeah.
It's so much closer when you live in the country, I find. And now I'm further off, and it still aggravates me, but it's not as bad. And when you live there in the Bible Belt with all the religious fanatism, yeah, in rural Pennsylvania. I lived in Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh is okay, but when you go elsewhere, it's not. Penn State is also not a place where you find a lot of kids. It's a state college.
Yeah.
And I taught classes of 500 students. It's a big manufacturing of knowledge. It's a big factory. I did not like that, the anonymity, which we have here as well, but it's not the same scale as it is at Penn State. And my wife wasn't happy there, and she wanted to go to Canada. She's Canadian, and again a coincidence at one meeting, society meeting, where I was on the board of directors. Chris Lalonde, who's in our department, who's also on the board of directors. After the board meeting, we drank whiskey in his hotel room. He said, "Oh, we have this position now open. Why don't you apply?" And I applied and got the position here, and that's why I'm here. It's a lot of coincidence that led me to where I am, I would say. A lot of opportunities, sometimes bad decisions, sometimes good decisions.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I like it
Yeah.
here. So I think that was a good decision to come here.
Yeah, absolutely. And so thinking about your research here, what projects are you most proud of?
I'm most proud of, there are two lines of research that I'm really doing. One is I write a couple of theoretical papers where I try to defend some sort of constructivism. I am at core still a Piagetian in some sense, because Jean Piaget, a famous developmental psychologist, and he would say a philosopher more, he argued that there are qualitative differences among children of different ages. And that is due to the way in which knowledge structures or the organization of knowledge develops in the active interaction of the child and the world, which includes others. And the criticism of Piaget is that the little infant is already a scientist in the crib. There are not many qualitative differences. Nativism is rising, or was big at some time. It's now going down a little bit again. And there were challenges to a constructivist worldview that I try to defend in those papers, making clear that it's more complex when you have infancy data to interpret this. For example, it doesn't show that infants see the world the same way as we do. It's an adultocentric position that you're taking. There are other interpretations possible and so on. Therefore, and one important argument that I think also developed in those papers is, and it's not so novel, but unfortunately I think you have to reiterate it nowadays more and more. Every kind of observation that we make as scientists is a snapshot. And in order to make sense of, it's the same way as kids make sense of the world. We as scientists construct something, but your construction becomes more plausible if you see it in the context of a sequence. And the sequence is the developmental sequence. Therefore, you look at the behavior at one point in time, but you have a better idea of what it means if you can look at what it came from, what it developed out for, how it looked like, say, half a year ago, and what it develops into a year from now. Therefore, you have to follow children through time. You have to observe them repeatedly, ideally even in your everyday context, because you understand your own kids in some sense and understand what they mean and can see how something develops. Ideally, you want to do this with your research participants as well, which would be too much of a burden to the parents, of course, to come here every day for a couple of hours. But that is one of the main messages that I think I always wanted to bring across, that you have to contextualize a child's behavior also in terms of the development of a sequence or sequential development, what comes before and what comes after. But also you have to contextualize it in another sense. That is something that I think grasped better over the last couple of years. You have to contextualize it more in terms of the relationships and the larger socioeconomic conditions the child lives in. And that has an enormous influence on individual differences among children, how they develop. Yeah. I mean, I knew this already in Philadelphia when I did my dissertation. I did my dissertation research partly in schools that were in inner cities, where you had to go through a metal detector to get in, and there were no textbooks. And the kids did on these standardized tests on tasks that 6-year-olds should solve. 9-year-olds didn't solve them. And I went to private schools in the suburbs of Philadelphia, some of the richest suburbs in the whole of the United States, like Chestnut Hill. And there the kids had personal computers in the 90s already at their desks and did on these tasks even better than you would expect the standard age group. And these differences, I mean, they're not genetic, you can tell me what you want. There are differences that are due to stimulation, to opportunities that exist in rich environments that children encounter. I think that has an enormously important role. And my recent research here, where I think I can be perhaps boast with a couple of studies. One important finding from a previous study where we looked at parent-child interaction. Children were about 2, 3, 4 years old, and we followed them over time, and we gave them a puzzle, and they had to solve it with their parents, and we looked at how parents supported children. And at the same time, we assessed their cognitive development, therefore how the kids did independently on tasks where they had to solve cognitive problems, keep stuff in mind, memory tasks we gave them. And we found that more sensitive scaffolding by parents predicted individual differences in children's cognitive performance over time. Therefore, and what does sensitive scaffolding mean? Sensitive scaffolding means that you don't just show the child what to do. You don't give the solution away, because that's the worst thing you can do. Then the child doesn't have to do any work by him or herself anymore. But at the same time, you don't just ignore the child when the child needs help, but rather, if you can do something a little bit, then I give you some pointers. If these pointers are not strong enough, I give you a little bit more structure. Therefore, I increase structure as you need. But then, when you start getting in the right direction and start to solve it, I withdraw structure again. Therefore, depending on where you are, I always tailor my support in a manner that is sensitive to your state of knowledge. And those parents who did this in the problem-solving task, their children actually did then better 2 years later in these individualized problem-solving situations.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah, and that I think points to the importance of social interactions. I think that's another key message for me, at least, that social interaction is really important already. I mean, I come from an attachment background as well, where I know how important these sensitive bodily interactions between caregivers and infants are early in life, and how long-lasting effects they might sometimes have. But that's one research study where we documented the importance of social interaction for cognitive development, because there's some people who argue it's all in the genes, and individual differences are completely determined by nature, therefore by your genetic endowment. And I think that is not the correct answer. It's much more complex. Interestingly, I mean, the complexity then is even further, kids who are then more advanced in their cognitive skills challenge parents more. Therefore, it's a reciprocal relationship as well. It becomes more complex. The whole complexity, you only do justice to the complexity if you take into account the complex back and forth that you find in these interactions. And it's a reciprocal relationship.
And it also makes me think about technology and the advent of cell phones and how we talk about the dangers of distracted driving, but I feel there's also distracted parenting.
Yeah. That is an area of research that I have recently started with Sam Louis from Exercise Science. We look at the effects of cell phones on middle school children. And the starting point of this was that schools actually called up and said, what do we know about cell phones and the effects of cell phones on middle schoolers, and should we ban them from the school grounds? And there is not that much knowledge on this topic. And what you could find is strong opinions that were not evidence-based. But there's actually a piece in the Guardian 2016, where it's an op-ed piece by educators saying we need policies restricting screen time for kids. And then there's a response by other educators and some psychologists who say we simply don't know enough and we shouldn't rush into this. There's a lack of knowledge. And what we are doing is, in our research, we're looking at different middle schools that have different cell phone policies. One middle school doesn't allow it at all, therefore it's a ban. Another one has an educational policy. And the third one basically is laissez-faire. They allow any use of cell phone. They often use it for educational purposes as well, in, for example, French classes to look up vocabulary. And we follow children who are in 6th to 8th grade over time, now I think for the second year, and look at cell phone use. What do they use their cell phone for? Is it communication? Is it a game? Is it educational use? And what kind of effect does it have on their mental health, on their friendship pattern, on their leisure time activity, and number of different attention span? The interest for me, I mean, there are a number of interesting ideas about interesting speculations. On the one hand, I think that particular early adolescence, mid-adolescence is an enormously important time for friendships and creating intimacy, emotional disclosure, often in same-sex friendships. And to what extent does cell phone use influences? Because texting, posting something on Instagram is different than having a long conversation with somebody. It's a much different form of communication. How does it change it? It's also the whole non-verbal part of communication, like indicating what emotion another person has. I mean, you can put an emoji next to it, but the subtlety of emotional expression and recognizing these emotional expressions is different when you use it with cell phone. Therefore, it's an interesting idea. How do these patterns change? Interesting idea also, does it affect their mental health? Because the depression, and particularly in girls, has been linked to social media use, and their Facebook blues is a notion that you find. The preliminary results show that, I mean, we had 3 groups of kids essentially in our studies. Some, about 10 to 20%, who didn't have any cell phone. Then we had a cell phone addiction questionnaire. About 20 to 25% were cell phone addicted. That is, they couldn't do without their cell phone. They were nervous when they couldn't check it, and the rest was using it, but not as heavily as those who were cell phone addicted. And there was no difference between those who had no cell phone and those who used it in a moderate way. But those who were addicted had, up to now, we have to follow them further, but they showed relatively poor mental health. They had issues with friendships and all these things that you would expect. Therefore, it's not necessarily the case that any kind of use has a negative effect, or any quantity of use. It's only excessive use that has a negative effect on children.
So Interesting.
But it's even more complex, I would say, because I think that screen time differs not just in terms of quantity, but it also differs in terms of the amount of, it differs in terms of the activity that you're doing. You could just passively consume something, like watch something on a YouTube, on YouTube. You can surf the internet, there's some activity involved. You can communicate through Skype, for example, which is very different. You can use Facebook as a way of expression in Facebook or other social media for self-expression, and you can create content, like use it for art, for example, creation. And all these different uses will differ dramatically in terms of what kind of consequences they have. And there has not been a lot of research on this topic. And I would be careful to say screen time in itself is
too blanket a term.
Exactly. And it is not just that the quantity and then also the type of screen time that you have plays a role, but also the social context again comes in, because in one study in Great Britain they found that screen time excessive screen time again had a negative effect on mental health, but the negative effect was only 1/3 of that of getting a regular breakfast in the morning. Therefore, therefore it's a family situation, the context, and maybe then screen time and unregulated screen time is just an expression of family chaos that is there and really the driving force behind it. And by saying, we have to limit and create policies on children's screen time, you do not really address the major problems that's underlying it. And another important point is as well, do you do screen time with others together? I mean, when you have Skype, you do it with another person, but you can play computer games together, which is very different. Or you can talk while watching a YouTube video. You can talk to someone. Like my 7-year-old, he always watches soccer now on YouTube, and then he wants to show me something about Messi, and he says, "Did you see this move?" And then he replays it, and therefore it's an interaction around it. It's not solitary. It's a way of starting a communication and maintaining a communication. Therefore, it's not an isolated incident. And that, I think, is also important for kids. I mean, they hook up and communicate about what they do on the internet, and that is something that can create a friendship and stabilize a friendship. And therefore, I do work on screen time. I think it will have the effect of screen time on children's development will be as pervasive as the development of writing systems in the long run, because it's cross technology. You know, when you have TV, I mean, you watch TV, but computers and screens now pervade everything. They are tools that we use for making calendars, for writing, for communicating. They replace our brain activity because they do the calculations for us. And that dramatically changes childhood and child development. Vygotsky, a Russian or Soviet psychologist, wrote about the importance of writing and how it changed. Therefore, cultural tools, how they change cognition and how they change development. I think something similar we are facing with now the new technologies, the communication technologies that we have. They will change communication dramatically. And they change it already in our lifetime. When I remember I started academia, there was hardly any email, and
me too.
I got my first computer in my second year of studies, and it was an old machine. And
the same story.
And nowadays, without email, we write papers through email, and that was not.
It's unreal.
It is very different in the sense, and how you edit, how you write the paper, the whole writing process changes, and you typed it up. Then go over with Tipex, or what do you call it?
It used to be all the same. Well, it's interesting how you've done a lot on technology and child development. And you've also done a lot of work on nature and child development, which to my mind seems like maybe two completely different endeavors. But how do you see that?
To some extent they are, I would say. It's an interesting question to what extent experiences with nature and experiences with technology are similar and different, or could be even similar and different. Now, of course, there are opposing trends. The more time kids spend in front of screens, the less time they will spend elsewhere. That means, among others, outside and time spent outdoors has decreased quite significantly over the last 20, 30 years. There are a variety of reasons for that. Among others, parents often feel that it's not safe to let the kids outside, and there's of course a destruction of nature is not as accessible anymore. And kids nowadays are more hurried. The hurried child, they're put into some kind of organized activities but don't spend as much unstructured time by themselves outdoors anymore. Therefore, there's a decrease of time spent outside, and there are people who think that is leading to something called a nature deficit disorder. That is not a clinical diagnosis, but it is meant to indicate that children can't regulate themselves anymore as well, because nature is important for the development of self-regulation. They don't play as well. A number of other outcomes, negative outcomes, are associated with this. And in response to the decrease of time spent outdoors, I think it was the Zug School District started a nature kindergarten a couple of years ago, 2011. And it was a project that was jointly initiated by parents, by educators, and by people from Camosun, professors from Camosun and UVic. And I was part of it, the whole development of it, safety plan and curriculum, all these aspects. And we were asked at that point by the vice principal of the school district, in order to provide data to support the nature kindergarten, or at least show that it's not detrimental to kids to be outside. We were asked to do a research study assessing the children at the beginning of the school year in the nature kindergarten and at the end of the school year, and also comparing them to children in a regular kindergarten. Therefore, we had children spending from 8:45 to 11:45 outside every day, regardless of weather. I think they weren't outside twice because of wind or so, and but that was it. And we compared those children, two cohorts from the same kindergarten. We compared them to a regular kindergarten children, and we found that the kids were not doing worse in terms of their cognitive functioning. There were no negative effects on the working memory, on the spatial skills, but also no positive effects, as others have found. They were just not different. There were no difference in change over the school year. We had speculated that they would be much more active outside than they are in a regular indoor kindergarten, and we had put accelerometers, like Fitbits, Fitbits. Yeah? You put them on there and you measure there's a sedentary, moderate activity, vigorous activity, and that's a real concern, because most Canadian children don't reach the benchmark for vigorous activity per day, which is 60 minutes. Even at the age of 5, you should be active for 60 minutes, and only 20% of the children reach this. Now, almost all of the children in our study reached this benchmark, and there was no difference between those being indoors and those being outside, which was really surprising. Yeah. But we also gave them tests of motor coordination. Therefore, we chased them through the gym, and they had to throw balls and jump around and do other motor coordination tasks. And the children who had spent a year in the nature kindergarten, they had better motor coordination skills, and also, according to the teachers and parents, they did better in terms of their social functioning. Therefore, their social skills had improved over the course of 1 year more than the social skills of children in a regular kindergarten. And I think the one reason of that was that when I went out with them and walked on the tour, where they had one of 3 spots that they visited, one in Old Growth Forest, one on the beach, another in a meadow area with creeks around it, they often engaged in collaborative projects. Like one day they had to look for salamanders, and they had to join forces in order to lift these tree trunks, and that just struck me how much more collaborative is. And cooperation skills was one facet of the questionnaires that we gave parents and teachers where they showed improvements. There were also areas of research in retrospect that I would have loved to examine more. Like one was the kids, they often, in a school you sit there, the teacher writes something on the board, you go outside with kids, you have a certain plan, like, for example, looking for salamanders, and then the kids roam around and one finds a bird's nest, and then says, here, I found the bird's nest, and then all the other kids rush towards it. Yeah. The educator cannot say, please, you have to use it as a teachable moment, and the educator was just fantastic to do this, the teacher. It's much more unpredictable. Yes. Therefore, you can follow more the flow of what's going on in children, and you have to adjust as an educator. Yeah. And I thought that was really fascinating. Really yeah. And I wondered to what extent that also promoted creativity in kids. And I did not look at this. I found in 2 studies in Germany of these forest schools where they found that kids in forest schools are more creative than children in regular. Yes, the discovery learning. That's the thing that I think aspect that I did not. I noticed that the moment I went outside with them, I thought, this is not, you didn't cover this. Another aspect was, I then walked next to the kids and they said, oh yeah, do you know this type of fern? I didn't know. And then we talked about different types of fern. Therefore, they had knowledge of biodiversity that my kids who went to regular kindergarten don't have. Yeah. We didn't assess anything like that at all. And we had also a measure of nature relatedness, because one concern is that we get so distant from nature that we don't have any impetus to protect it and conserve it anymore. Yeah. And conserving nature, so an argument is, hinges on having a place attachment, having an early experience of being in nature, feeling essentially, as a German romantic writer said, Novalis, treating nature as a you. Therefore, it's not some abstract entity that you instrumentally can exploit, but rather something that is like a person, like somebody who's just opposite to you and you communicate with. Yeah. And
that's beautiful.
Yeah, that is Novalis was right. That was quite prescient. But that is. The argument is that contact with nature, early contact with nature, would foster this kind of nature relatedness that would be a prerequisite for later preserving of nature and care for nature, because care also in children arises in a relationship, and if you have no relationship to nature, why would you care? It's very difficult to build this up abstractly. Mm-hmm. You can, but it's more complicated. And we therefore assess nature relatedness as well by designing a board game for kids, and that we didn't find any difference there, but our board game was so bad. It was not a good effort. There is not much research on this topic in young children. And our first step was perhaps destined to not be perfect, and if I did it again, I would do it very differently, would do much more qualitative research. Interviewing children, having them draw their favorite places. We didn't think of that, for example. Yeah. And those kind of aspects I would incorporate more. But it was very interesting research. How is nature different from technology? I think you can both use in a very playful way. Both can be, if used rightly, very educational. I mean, elements in nature, they have no prescribed function. When you play with a piece of wood, I mean, you can use it in all different kind of possible ways, and it stimulates your imagination. Technology can similarly stimulate your imagination, not when you play a game with prefixed rules and characters, but there are some games that have been designed for kids that are similar to pretend games, where they use the imagination to dress up dolls and then organize a tea party or whatever they're doing. It can be used in a very creative way. But I think with technology, the danger is that there are too many games that have fixed rules, where there is not enough imagination required. Another difficulty, another question that I have with respect to technology is this virtual nature of technology. I mean, everything is indirect. It's not real nature that we're seeing when we watch a YouTube video on wildlife or whatever. And that's a very different experience. The senses are stimulated very differently when you are just virtually perceiving a reality. That might change with virtual reality becoming more and more advanced, but nowadays it still doesn't, I think, replace direct experience. And direct experience is for me still the foundation of knowledge. If you just have virtual experience, no direct experience with certain elements, you don't understand a phenomenon quite this well. It's a famous saying by a French philosopher, Merleau-Ponty. You only understand how to read a map if you have walked through the terrain. Therefore, this is abstract knowledge, but it's abstracted based on a certain activity that you have had, a shared lived experience with others. And with this virtual reality, I think you compromise some of it. Another fear that I have is that when you live in a virtual reality, there's this illusion of control that creates also a certain personality. Our lives, usually, you don't have this control, and you have to learn that you're not in control of those things. And there's not a sense of entitlement that you can change those, or you stop playing when you lose the game. But it's but in life, you cannot just stop at any particular point in time. This illusion of control, I wonder to what extent that is fostered by these new technologies. Therefore, I think there are some differences. I see a lot of advantages, and for my own work, of course, so many things that have make my life easier as an academic through the new technologies incorporated. But I think there has to be a balance between nature and technology, between direct experience and living in some kind of indirect virtual reality, which a lot of these new technologies then provide you with. Therefore, I would love to continue my research on nature-based education, expanding it, incorporating more observational data, more qualitative data of children, to understand really what experiences in nature foster what aspects of development, and also assess simply in a more ecologically valid way how cognition is affected by being in nature. If it's knowledge of biodiversity that is affected, well, we should measure this, and that exactly. We didn't. Therefore, there are certain aspects. I don't think that math skills necessarily are that much affected by it, but other skills might, and we didn't do a good job capturing this. It is the first good rough shot of it. It was the first study. It was the first study, the first study of it, and at least we had a control group of children in the regular kindergarten. We followed them over time. But there's a lot of stuff, there's a lot of work to do. In particular also how you balance living in with new technologies and nature, and what kind of right balance you can strike.
It seems like a really urgent question.
Yeah, it's often discussed in terms of how much nature, how much nurture, as if you can divvy them up and isolate them as separate influences. And I think that is a very wrong way of going about it. A point that is more and more recognized, because it's really the way in which they influence each other. In a way, it's a never-ending cycle where, because they're interwoven from the get-go, you can't really pull them apart ever. You can, however, ask how particular influences that you have in your lifetime lead to different kind of gene expressions in your lifetime. Therefore, the interaction between nature and nurture I find really important, between nature and culture. From a different perspective, I think it is not doing justice to separate them from the very fact how we as human beings come into the world, because in a way you could say that as at birth we are helpless creatures. We don't have to be as helpless as other creatures in the world. They come into the world with locomotion skills. They can use the communication system of the species. They have good eyesight, and they, after a couple of days, are independent from their parents. Some of them just are hatched and then go about their business like turtles and so on. They don't ever see their parents. But we humans, we are equipped biologically to be incomplete. Therefore, in our very biological disposition, there's something that is missing. And this requires culture. It requires the care of others. And the care of others brings with it culture, because care of others is always influenced by cultural context and what kind of ideas you have about raising kids. And they differ widely across different cultures. But this very fact that we are biologically deficient in some sense means that there's a gap at birth where culture has to come in. Therefore, it's in a way as if evolution has led to a lack of innate endowments in humans and has led at the same time to increasing influence of culture in humans, so that nature and culture are not two separate forces, but rather they feed into each other. Yeah. Biologically, we are dependent on culture. Therefore, there's I like sometimes these philosophers, but a German philosopher, Helmut Plessner, who calls the human condition natural artificiality. Because by nature we are artificial. You know, we have to, and if artificial means, according to Aristotle, that we depend on making ourselves artifact, then that is by nature our very condition. And then separating nature and culture out into two different factors is, to me, absolutely nonsensical. And I could talk about this more because there are nice biological data that you could adduce to make the points that I'm making. But I think that there is, from my perspective, that's a completely arbitrary, artificial distinction between those two. Yeah.
Oh, I love that. And what about stages of child development and life stages?
Yeah, well, life stages is a very interesting question because stages always require that you have qualitative differences between human beings. And unless there's a qualitative difference, you cannot say, okay, here's a different stage. Otherwise, it would just be incremental increases where you cannot separate one stage from the other, because you need some kind of step, some qualitative difference in order to say this is different than the other. I entirely agree that there are qualitative differences in development that I would call stages. The term stages has come into disrepute a little bit in the area of Piaget, because people say there are no qualitative differences, kids are little adults already, and I would not say this is quite correct. But stages raises also a very important other issue, because when you talk about stages in development, you often talk about universal stages. Do they hold across all different cultures? And I am not so sure whether they do. I think in some areas they might, like there are certain very elementary stages of cognitive development where you could say, okay, the child can grasp one object like this, and then the kid can use this object to pull this next. Therefore, you can construct a relation between your hand and one object, and then between your hand, the object, and another object. But these are very abstract kind of relations that you construct, and those complexity of relations, they can increase with development. There may be something universal. But as soon as you put in a particular content, like this toy may be something that a child raised in a Western culture can use in order to do this, but not a child raised in another culture. The cultural dependence, therefore, of stages such as Erikson's stages, with trust, and then Erikson has 8 stages through the life that start with a stage of trust versus mistrust and ends with a stage of despair versus hope. Therefore, old age, either you look back on your life and you think, oh my God, I screwed up all my life and there's nothing I can do about it, and let's just hang it up, and or hope, or you can just look at your life and say, okay, this was not that good, but I learned from it and so on, and it's just the person who I am. The interpretation, again, the construction plays an important role. But whether all these stages exist across all different cultures that Erikson, for example, came up with, or others, is for me an open question. And in addition, I think life stages, they also change depending on cultural developments. Like one development psychologist said, well, we have this adolescent stage, and now we have emergent adulthood, which comes between adolescence and adulthood, because more and more teenagers, not even teenagers, even tweens, they are not financially independent. They explore different relationships. That's usually what you did in adolescence, and they live with their parents. Therefore,
I have one in my house.
Yeah, but it's different. The dependence is not. It's not like in adulthood where they don't consider themselves adults in the sense, and therefore the development psychologists, okay, we need a new stage. Immersion. Why is this new stage necessary? Because, well, the time to get an education increases. Why is that necessary? Because our economic system changes and new skills are required. Therefore, with with economic and technological changes, there may then also be new stages. And therefore, I think that stage theories are, to some extent, also culturally dependent.
Yeah.
And the ideas, I mean, even when you have a stage, when you have a stage of development now, like take Piaget's theory, and you say, okay, the stage of development, the goal of cognitive development is be able to reason scientifically. Well, so should that be the goal of cognitive development? What kind of cultural value do you bring in to say this is the goal to which development has to go towards? Whenever you have a stage, you have an end point. And the end point reflects the cultural value. And this end point, with different cultural values, you can construct different endpoints to which then development converges. And that is something which I think always has to be critically reflected upon when you do developmental psychology. It's a construction. Therefore, I come back. If you apply it to myself, stage theories are constructed. Even Piaget's constructed with theory was constructed.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for joining us here for Life Stories Conversations. I've really enjoyed our talk today. Thank you so much.